I'm delighted to be able to introduce our guest speaker this week, which is John Carter, the Chief Executive of Jersey Heritage, who's going to be talking to us about cultural heritage management on the island of Jersey, in the Channel Islands, for those of you that don't know, and the particular challenges of managing cultural heritage in that kind of microcosm of Jersey. So I'll pass it straight over to you, John.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation to share some thoughts with you. I feel the urge in this setting to say up front, I'm not an archaeologist. I speak to you as a museum curator, chief executive of a charity, a local historian. We run museums, archives, and aspects of historic environment in Jersey. I'm also an islander. I was born in Jersey. I worked there for 30 years. People don't have careers like that anymore, I know. But I say all that to make the point that I speak to you very much as an islander looking out. One of the things we've been trying to do the last few years in Jersey is to encourage more academics, more universities from the UK and France to look in to Jersey to help us with a perspective on heritage management issues. And a good example of that, we've been delighted to have Matt Dav students from the MA course here to help us at one of the castles. Very much hope that's something that we'll be able to continue, and there's a lot of opportunities to do so, which I might try to touch on. So this is really a talk about heritage in islands, with Jersey as an example. Now, as you probably know, there's an extensive literature on the subject of island archaeology going back to the 19th century. I think the jury's probably still out on whether islands societies really do have distinct island characteristics rather than characteristics in common with adjacent coastal maritime communities. But nevertheless, I'll talk about some of the themes of islandness as they're expressed in heritage that we manage in Jersey. There's a rather more recent island studies literature on heritage in islands, and heritage in islands is particularly tested because, especially in small places, there's a lot of competition for land use, there's contested versions of identity, and there's limited access to national and international resources. So they kind of do characterize a kind of small island heritage management framework. And I'll talk a bit about how we're handling some of those issues in Jersey. I think I probably need to start with a bit of background about where Jersey fits into the heritage management world, though. So we're a British Crown dependency. We're outside the UK and outside the European Union. And so that's one of the reasons why we're beyond the national heritage management framework, and particularly beyond national funding streams. We are party to international heritage conventions, World Heritage, Grenada, Valletta, that sort of thing, but the relevant obligations are delivered under local legislation, so they've got their own character. Over the last 30 years, the government's responsibilities under those conventions have really been outsourced to our organisation, Jersey Heritage. We're an independent, non-profit charity. We've grown up entirely outside government. We operate museums, archives, public records management for government, for example. We do heritage sites management of a lot, but not all heritage sites in public ownership. And we do advice, so listing buildings, some aspects of archaeological monitoring. So it's quite a broad front. But because there's no history of holistic government involvement, direct government involvement in heritage in Jersey, there's quite a lot of gaps in the infrastructure. We are a bit off grid in that sense. So, for example, there's no state archaeologist, there's no treasure legislation, no portable antiquities reporting scheme, no historic environment record. So those are some quite big differences which account for why we're so keen on help from the outside world. So we're very much of an island in the heritage world. So I'll just talk about some of the past. That insularity is expressed in the evolution of the landscape that we manage. So if I talk a bit about the oldest chapters in our story, and particularly about the importance of the sea. So for islands like Jersey, Britain, I guess as a whole, the sea's a barrier and a highway throughout our story, separating us, connecting us, always shaping the record. And that separateness and closeness is very obvious from a distance, like that kind of satellite picture. So this is, for those that don't know, this is Jersey, Guernsey, Northern Ireland of Alderney. There's a French Channel Island called Chaussee, but you can see how close we are to France. That's about a 20-minute boat trip if you're going reasonably fast, but it is quite a French setting. However, not so long ago, that scene, and there's Jersey there, Guernsey, Alderney, would have looked more like that. Less than 10,000 years ago, in fact, the entire Normanno-Breton Gulf region was an important landscape over which Neanderthals and modern humans had moved freely for much of the previous 500,000 years or so. The Channel Islands were important terrestrial islands between major rivers, and the coast was somewhere here off Cornwall and Brittany. And today it's often coastal erosion processes of increasingly energetic sea, which are both revealing and threatening the archaeological record that we're managing. So here's an example of that. This is the Neanderthal rock shelter at La Cotte de Saint-Brelade on the southwest coast of Jersey. It's a unparalleled, in some ways, record of climate and environmental change in the region over a 200,000 year period, and how our Neanderthal cousins coped and adapted to that change over several ice ages. It's famous for its unique curated bone heaps of mammoth and rhino, and the theory that Neanderthals collaborated to drive them from the cliff at the top before they were butchered. Recently, new underwater research by colleagues from a consortium of UK universities is revealing for the first time really what the Ice Age landscape around Jersey would have looked like, and to see this now coastal site from an earlier inland perspective, looking up from the valleys and ravines offshore, shown in the bathymetric survey, rather than out to sea. That's going to flip the way the site's been seen and given us new insights into Neanderthal behaviour, the significance of which I'll come back to later. Between 9,000 years, 7,500 years ago, the sea level rose and Jersey became, during a long process, first a tidal island, then an island. And that's the process which, because of the shallow seas and the huge tidal range, there's about a 40-foot tidal range, is played out every day as the sea goes in and out, especially around the southeast coast, where the sea goes out about 2 miles. These are oyster beds up there. That's our smallest managed heritage site, an 18th century tower called Seymour Tower, which is available for rent, by the way, stay in Jersey. And from that period of inundation in the Mesolithic through the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, it seems that maritime contact was maintained between the islands and the mainland. Seafaring had become a characteristic of what was then island life, and maybe the sea was thought of as a component in a cultural landscape marked by megaliths. This is Faldaway, Dolmen in the East Coast. Many of these were excavated and restored in the 19th century, and at that time were becoming part of a heritage tourism landscape. There's 59 megalithic structures in Jersey and Guernsey, perhaps 130 or so were destroyed by quarrymen in the 19th century. And the surviving monuments occupy largely elevated coastal positions. Many earlier monuments show reuse during the Bronze Age, and it's been suggested that they may have been displaying connections to the sea at a time of increased use of waterways. A lot of those sites are now free-to-access sites in the landscape. One of them in particular is a museum site that we manage. This is Le Hugby, where we have our archaeological museum. It's passage grave constructed around 4000 BC. It's been described as one of the 10 oldest buildings in the world. I guess you define buildings, but it's certainly one of the largest and best preserved passage graves in Europe. The entrance to the monument was restored in 1993. It's only had that appearance quite recently. And it's showing for the first time in a very long time that the equinoctial sunrise penetrates down the passage to the sanctuary, the back of the chamber. And this event twice a year has become a big part of our heritage calendar, with people queuing outside the gates in the dark. So these monuments and their associated material culture do appear consistent with mainland contact. So at least in some periods, prehistoric seaways must have been really busy connecting the islands with the wider region. But there is also a barrier And the remoteness of islands does allow periods of isolation and separation from the action, really. So, and that remoteness, even if it's only temporary, the idea of being offshore from something is a second theme of island heritage. And maybe that is part of the story of this amazing item, the Archaeology 2 Jersey hoard, discovered by detectorists in 2012. It's the largest hoard of coins from the Celtic world. It's also one of the largest assemblages of precious metal torques. My colleagues keep telling me to stop calling it a coin hoard. It's one of a number of hoards in Jersey linked to the Coreo-Solites tribe, who were based around the Ross. So in that picture of Jersey, earlier the Breton Peninsula was cut off, but south of Jersey is an estuary now with St Malo and Dingle, if you've heard of them, and the Coreo-Solites are based around there. And there's one a number of hoards that are associated in one way or another with a time around the Roman invasion of Gaul. It was found by detectorists chasing Richard and Reg, that's them, chasing a story which they had heard 30 years ago. So they were looking for this for 30 years. The story was that of some loose coins when a tree was uprooted, and it was one of those sort of fir tree on the left in the field, second from the right. And they'd searched this area over an exceptionally long period before they hit the jackpot. Although there's no formal reporting scheme, they did report it to Jersey Heritage, and it was recovered professionally. It's been a highlight of our work. We've been able to do a 3-year micro excavation in the public space of the museum. That picture you saw earlier, with a huge number of people visiting as it was taken apart coin by coin. So apart from the coins, of which there are around 70,000, just under, and the chalks, of which there are parts of 11, there are a number of other quite intriguing items. That worked stone, which might be metalworking hammer, and there's a Bronze Age spear down there on the right, which might have been 800 years old when the hoard was buried. So that idea of heritage in prehistory is quite an intriguing one, isn't it? But does it tell us anything about remoteness and connection? Well, it's easy to imagine tribal wealth being brought offshore to a peripheral haven to be hidden from the genocidal and tax-hungry Roman legions, but that does seem to play to a very contemporary narrative of offshore finance, and that's largely how it's presented in Jersey, I have to say. In Guernsey, there are no coin hoards. They have a great deep water harbour. Jersey's south coast, as you saw in that earlier slide, prevents a very hazardous approach because of those shallow seas and reefs, so perhaps it is a safer offshore hideout. But while it's unprecedented in scale and character, it's got quite a lot in common with hoards on both sides of the channel, and the coins do apparently show signs of cross-channel exchange. So the possibility has been raised that in fact the island may have been the centre of the production of these coins. So there's some very big questions about what was happening in Iron Age Channel Islands. It goes right to the heart of one of those many island paradoxes about our identity, because border territories, like islands, are frontiers to a number of different interiors. They're both, in a sense, always peripheral and always centres. So in addition to the hoards from that Iron Age period, there's a number of promontory forts. This one's called Catal de Lec on the northwest of the island. The contours of the earthwork itself have been revealed for the first time in my lifetime by a recent programme of sheep grazing. There's a 19th century guardhouse underneath. So Barry Cunliffe talks about these sorts of promontory forts as artefacts of a maritime society, quoting Caesar's description of the Celtic tribes who, when they were bottled up by Roman advance, would bring up ships and retire to neighbouring coastal strongholds. And that idea introduces a third characteristic, really, one which I think we have in common with many coastal areas and many border territories, that islands, small islands, are often contested territory. They're often in the military front line. And in Jersey, this has produced a fortified landscape, a really impressive duration and diversity and density. Most of what you can see today in stone, at least, is a consequence of the position of the islands following King John's loss of Normandy in 1204. So at the start of 1204, the islands were at the centre of an Anglo-Norman realm that stretched pretty much from the borders of Scotland down to the borders of Spain. It was relatively safe territory. But when the French king took Rouen in that year. And instantly, the islands found themselves on the front line, a forward bastion of the English crown, but as I said, 20 minutes from France. So naval power was a factor in retaining the islands for the crown, but land-based defences became very important from that time as well. And the island was garrisoned from 1204 right up until the 1930s. So in terms of that range of fortifications, they range maybe from the Neolithic, certainly from the Iron Age, like this, right up to the Cold War. And the most recent Cold War construction in Jersey, which was radio station, actually not a fortification, was only completed in 1993. But just in terms of the sites that Jersey Heritage manages directly, there are medieval castles. So this is King John's Castle, Montorgueil, began in the years immediately after 1204. There are Tudor defences. This is Tudor in origin, although it's substantially 18th century now. It's the castle that Matt Dowd and colleagues have been working on. It was built when advancing Castle of Redundant. There are Napoleonic defences. There's a number of these so-called Jersey round towers. So they're a precursor of the Martello towers, those matriculations at the top being quite a unique aspect of the local round towers. This is called the Rocco in St. One's Bay on the west of the island, which we've just finished refurbishing. There's Victorian fortifications. This is called Fort Leicester. A lot of these were built in the 1830s when steamships for the first time could hold in the tide. So ships under sail would just be whisked past in these 4 or 5 knot currents, especially on the north coast. Steamships for the first time could hold in the tide to bombard the island and disembark troops. There was a major panic when steamships appeared, and a response in terms of these Victorian fortifications. There are a lot of World War II fortifications from the German occupation. This one, MP2, is one of a number of range-finding towers for inland naval batteries. It was converted in the 70s for the Coast Guard, so that box on top isn't something that we've done, although again, you can hire it if you come to Jersey. So it's one of our most popular heritage lets, actually. This is our most recent acquisition. Again, it's a German structure in origin. It's a German telephone exchange, but it was converted in the 50s as a sort of a Cold War-related nuclear monitoring station, not entirely unlike the one that you have in York. It later had civil defence organisation functions. We've just taken this on. So we've got a huge range of time, really diverse and very dense. The 18th century structures I referred to comprise boulevards, roads, hospitals, harbours. There's over 100 late 18th century structures alone just in that period. There are an unbelievable number of German bunkers. So the density of this landscape is really quite impressive. And one of the heritage management challenges that we have is partly through selection, but how we make sense of conserve this very dense legacy of our vulnerability to foreign powers. Now that vulnerability, of course, as it has in many small places, has tended to produce an equal and opposite reaction in terms of resilience and resourcefulness common to islanders generally to survive in areas of limited economic resources, even without the depredations of raiding parties and occupying forces. Coastal living brings exposure to dangers, for sure, but it also brings proximity to marine resources and the opportunity for overseas trade. And some of that activity has left marks on the landscape. That's a very old photograph, but it's the port of Gorey beneath King John's Castle. And that port developed like a frontier town in the oyster boom between 1810 and 1850, supplying chartered companies of Kent and Sussex. About 300 fishing smacks, some of which you can see manned by 2,000 British seamen, 1,000 islanders. And at that level of activity, it was inevitable that it was overfished and that industry collapsed in the 1850s. This is a very early photograph from the mid-1840s. There are an awful lot of very early photographs in Jersey as a bit of a detour, because the island was outside the 19th century legislation in both France and England where the copyright fiercely protected the new invention of photography. So that was another one of those island phenomenons, really. Anyway, back to the oyster industry. In historic environment terms, it's left a legacy of quite a number of small harbours, heritage harbours they're referred to by port, the local ports authority. These were built in the prosperous years to handle that huge fleet coming from Kent to handle the oysters. Shipbuilding was another part of the 19th century economic boom, but one that hasn't really left very much in the way of historic environment, because these wooden ships were built on the beach, and that's completely disappeared, our own small industrial revolution on the beach. The industry was, again, an island thing, partly the result of our being able to fix our own import duties, but pay no dues on goods going into Britain. So the effect of that was that Jersey ships built and rigged with high quality but cheaply imported Baltic timber and Russian hemp could be sold in England at a lower price than English-built ships using lower grade material. It was good while it lasted, like so many things about island life, but suddenly in the 1860s, that industry collapsed due to rapid expansion of steel steamboats requiring a kind of industrial infrastructure that Jersey didn't have the scale and capacity to manage. But while the yards left very little, some of the wealth from that period it survives in some of the domestic architecture. So this building here is actually now part of Jersey Museum. Those of you that might have come to Jersey, the new museum building is attached there. So it's quite a grand house down by the commercial centre of the harbour. It was built in the 1820s by the Neanderthal family, who were part of this new merchant class emerging from the riches gained through worldwide carrying trade, and particularly cod fishing. So that family, for example, they were the largest in Jersey. They had 55 ships and several shipyards in Jersey. At that time, the head of the family who lived in that house was a French homeopathic doctor called Geneste. He was a proscrit, a political exile. He'd arrived in 1852, and he introduces another theme of islandness that crops up throughout history, that of exile and refuge. So just as islanders have reached out to the world, so the community has been enriched by a long history of migration into Jersey, including many who've been exiled for political reasons from events elsewhere. So in that revolutionary tide in the mid-19th century, thousands of Europeans headed for London, but London was a pricey option for exile. Jersey was a lot cheaper because even then of the tax and situation. It was healthy, which British cities weren't, of course, at the time, and it was now had decent steamboat connections to France and England. So Geneste was a not very well-known character, but he was a particularly good friend in Jersey of the French romantic writer Victor Hugo, who spent 3 years in exile in Jersey before the bulk of his time in exile, which was actually in Guernsey. But the Jersey period, so he wrote a lot, famously, in Guernsey, but the Jersey period was particularly interesting for his graphic art. He drew a lot and took a lot of photographs. There's a new experiment with photography. I don't know if it's related to this proliferation of patent avoiding British and French photographers of the island. It may well have been, but his project, he was intending to publish a photographically illustrated book of Jersey, and that itself was quite an innovative idea at that time. But in many ways, his art from that period is an early exploration of what you might call a heritage tourism landscape. He really was very keen on prehistoric stones. He had a great interest in dolmens. This is one of his drawings, and he likened their appeal to the monuments of ancient Greece, and they provide a setting for a number of his poems, exploring as he would a deep sense of the elemental and the mysteries of creation, death, and the beyond. But he is also keen on castles. This is Grone, a slighted 13th century castle in the northwest of the island, and he wrote of that, "I would be buried here if I never returned to France," he said. And in these early photographic images, he often reimagined them in a slightly Gothic way in his drawings, like that on the right, and he sought to convey, as he put it, more or less what I have in view, but above all what I have in mind. This is another one of his photographs and redrawings of the hermitage, so-called, at Elizabeth Castle, which is an oratory that's all that's left of the 12th century abbey of St Helier on that islet now occupied by the castle itself. And that sort of appreciation, romantic reimagining really, of the landscape is the background to the emergence of tourism, I think, and what you might call heritage tourism later in the century. So these are postcards from later in the century of some of the first booming period tourists doing something similar to Hugo in exploring the wilds and the caves in those health and safety free days when it was easier to give people access to these rather scary cliffs on the north coast. But again, they're doing the same thing really. They're exploring this idea of reconnection with nature and its spiritual qualities and its potential for physical well-being that are still really at the heart of coastal tourism today. We'd probably call it well-being now, wouldn't we? And that was a really important consideration in the growth of early tourism. Hugo said that Jersey was where England sent her delicate chest, and during that period, Jersey also began to develop not just the natural stuff, but some of the other qualities around its reputation as a spa and health resort. Obviously, rather strangely for some reason, but two really keen advocates of Jersey's health and well-being status were Marx and Engels, who visited a couple of times because Engels was an unhealthy person, but Marx was a keen advocate of Jersey as a solution for its health. So the island began to acquire some of the facilities familiar to the idea of the seaside. In the Victorian period, a number of quite large seawater lidos. It's a bit hard to make out in that photograph, but that's the Victoria Marine Lake in Jersey. At one point, it was the biggest seawater pool in Britain. Promenades, parks, and the emergence of the beach itself as a cultural space. And that kind of development of that tourism heritage, of which we have quite a lot, from the late 19th, early 20th century, culminated in this rather spectacular building, the Fort Regent Leisure Centre. So Fort Regent is this Napoleonic fort. It's finished in 1815, just in time for Waterloo, and was used as a coal yard and a dump for cars. And then in the 1974, this incredible single-span waveform roof was created. It's a listed structure. When the English Heritage 20th Century Listing Inspectors came, it was the only thing in Jersey they were really interested in. It's a spectacular structure, built in a really grand gesture of unmitigated confidence at the height of the oil crisis, when people really believed in tourism. So that's a bit of a whistle stop, but I hope it gives an idea of the range and this density and diversity of what the heritage landscape is that expresses some of our islandness. It's a mixture of buildings and stories and tangible heritage, and it holds some of those paradoxes of this sort of contrasting identity, independent but subordinate, vulnerable but resilient, exotic and liminal, but also deeply conservative socially in ways. So I want to talk now about how we're using some of those heritage resources, perhaps especially in the regeneration of tourism. Tourism is vital to funding our heritage service. I'm conscious that the word regeneration might strike a slightly odd note when you're talking about Jersey, which is undoubtedly very wealthy by any standards, but it probably wouldn't surprise you that anywhere with an economy based on offshore finance has got some very serious concerns about its longer term future. It's absolutely crucial that Jersey does diversify its economy after years and years and years in which the towel was really thrown in on tourism. And there's a fresh interest in tourism, and heritage does have an important part to play. That story of decline in our tourism isn't really very dissimilar to the story of decline in seaside resorts in Britain, and all for the same similar reasons. The period after the construction of Fort Regent was really the peak of tourism activity in Jersey, but a marked decline followed, and it was propped up only during the 1980s by the Bergerac effect. Now, I don't know how many of you remember Bergerac. I've shown this slide to students elsewhere. They looked at me completely blankly. Do you remember Bergerac? It's not shown anymore for a variety of reasons. These TV shows can have an amazing effect. There's something similar, I think, with the Shetland TV series in those islands now. But this really propped it 11 years. This ran of free advertising for Jersey, and it disguised as long-term structural decline. They were really prosperous years for tourism, and it was still in that prosperous period that Jersey Heritage was set up. And we grew on income from tourists, not from government expenditure or other forms of tourism. So when the rapid decline came, and in 1997, 4 or 5 years after that, with a 30% drop, it was very, very serious for us. I mean, ultimately, bed spaces halved. Most were converted to accommodation for finance workers, really. Visitors halved. Jersey had altogether fallen out of love with tourism, something which had really propped up in the 50s and 60s. And that was both politically and in the community. The finance sector was outstandingly successful. People told themselves they'd never liked tourists. Anyway, they were a nuisance after all. Even from a heritage perspective, in the days when we talked about the damaging effects on sites of too much visiting, rather as they do today in Thailand and Venice, and even York, I understand, that there was a mixed reaction about this decline. But the fact is that collapse had taken about a third of our funding and was creating a vicious cycle of decline in heritage investment, remembering that we're not eligible for things like Heritage Lottery Fund. So the challenges weren't just in direct revenue. As tourism had become less important politically, the value of heritage in a more general sense was called into question by islanders. A lot of pressure on land use for housing and offices to support financial services. And there was a sense, and this isn't specific to Jersey, there's a sense that heritage is in the way. We mustn't set the island in aspic very often. There's too much heritage in the brand. We need something more outward looking and modern and contemporary. There are far too many heritage attractions in Jersey for an island this size, we were told. So moving on from the Bergerac years, I'm going to talk a bit about 3 broad areas where we've been trying to meet some of those challenges to make heritage more relevant politically and to the community and the ambitions of the island, and to do that in the constraints and opportunities provided by an island setting. So the first set of questions about that really arises from what's perhaps the most obvious characteristic of islands, which is this question of boundaries, the boundedness of the island and its heritage management operation. It's obviously in the sense that obviously islands are geographically tightly defined. There are definite edges, and therefore we think edges of its heritage may be clear. But as we've seen in its history, the economic, social, cultural boundaries are an awful lot more fuzzy. And as with that history, the same ambiguity applies in the contemporary management of our heritage. So, what are the bounds of the area of study and of active conservation management by heritage organisations and the planning system? What are the boundaries of operational responsibility between different local and national heritage organisations? What are the boundaries and limits of commercial activities, sometimes necessary to support cultural activity? So answering those questions really has to start with mapping the heritage interest. I hope I've illustrated that we've got this density and of heritage, but it hasn't been adequately captured in terms of publicly accessible information. And 2 island factors apply, I think. I mean, this may be a slightly unfair example. This is the recently, a couple of years ago, published Oxford and other institutions Atlas of Iron Age hillforts, in which you will notice recently that despite coverage of islands like the Scillies, the Isle of Man, Shetland, the Shetland Islands, which has some really quite spectacular island sites, it is completely absent. And it's because, for part of the reasons of our history I've described, and despite being British, we're often beyond the gaze of British projects. As I say, it's slightly unfair, because in a sense the archaeology of the islands is indeed probably more significant to the continental than the British record, but nevertheless it's illustrative of this fact that we're slightly off-grid, the consciousness of many UK institutions. Another part of the issue is that the separate legal and administrative framework means that the norms of UK heritage systems haven't encompassed the islands, as I mentioned. So there's no government historic environment record, and if there'd been a historic environment record, that may well have alerted to people working on this project. So there's a bit of a cycle there. So we're trying to address that by building currently an historic environment record. The government in Jersey isn't going to do that. We've been talking for 15 odd years about that. So we've grasped the bull by the horns and we're doing it ourselves with Peter Child's here's help. We are addressing that point. So it's being constructed in a 3-year project. We're halfway through. We're using the Arches platform with the World Monuments Fund and the Getty Institute. And we're hoping that that will lead to an enhancement phase supported by a research framework and enable things like portable antiquities recording. So it's a great step forward for us, and we hope a lot will flow from it, including being noticed more outside the island. That's just an example of a page using a digital terrain map of that work in progress. Even at this stage, this issue of boundaries are encountered, not all of which we've got answers for. We've had a great deal of success in institutional boundaries. So we've been able to include not only sites records that came from our recent resurvey of the 4,500 listed places in Jersey. That sounds like a high number for 45 square miles. It partly reflects the fact there's no conservation areas in Jersey, so places are listed individually. So we've included our own resurvey. We've also included field walking records from the local Archaeological Society, which for years had been unobtainable. But the HER has given them what they regard as a safe home where their intellectual property can be made visible and their ownership properly acknowledged. So this very simple project really is proving an enormous step forward. Deposit modelling is going to be, and mapping is going to be significant. These are the remains of a periodically emerging disappearing Neolithic Bronze Age woodland in peat, just below the sands of Atlantic Storm Beach on the west of the island. It's only a very small part of a continuous archaeological horizon that extends not only out to sea under the waves, but a long way inland under later sand inundation. So deposit mapping is going to feature one of the enhancement projects we'll address once the initial HER inputs complete, although the Jersey variant of the PVG 16 still currently requires this business of drawing red lines around a map to define the limit of protection. Another one of these constructed boundaries we face in Jersey, as much as anywhere else really in heritage management, is this between natural and cultural heritage. It's going to be an interesting question for us if the HER in future includes linkages with biological data, but certainly if that nature-culture duality is relevant in mapping, it's certainly relevant in active conservation management on the island. So, and it's been relevant in the conservation work on some of these, we call them forts and towers sites. What have we got? About 15 of these sites now, mainly coastal fortifications and some follies. That building on the top left is a 1930s seaside beach hut, basically. When we've asked people in Jersey what they mean by heritage, well, there's words, isn't it, heritage? Well, what does it mean? What they mean very, very strongly is not museums and archives and records. What they mean is landscape. And it's overwhelmingly obvious that that's the answer. Coast, countryside, the natural and historic. So these boundaries between the natural and the historical landscape don't really exist in the minds of islanders. And I think probably that's the same, isn't it, in the UK population as a whole. I think that Didn't Visit Britain do a survey where the countryside is the highest ranking response to a question about what makes people proud to be British. So we know that in our case, about a third of visitors to Jersey encounter these free-to-access sites in the landscape, such as the Napoleonic Towers I talked about, the German bunkers. That's about the same number as come to the paid heritage attraction sites. So it's pretty significant. They're mainly encountering them as part of walking rather than heritage visiting experience. So it's a big issue for us, with the bulk of our earned income coming from paid museum visits and heritage attractions like the castle. How do we meet this challenge of developing the island as a whole? It seems important, even in terms of commercial self-interest, because none of the sites that we manage on the scale we manage them are ever going to be a destination attraction in their own right. The question for us is, can we animate, connect this dispersed landscape of heritage into something which might be, in terms of the island as a whole, a destination attraction. One of the examples of our attempt to expand beyond our museum sites, our attraction sites, has been a project to bring all these buildings into use as holiday lets. Now, many of these buildings until quite recently were economically unproductive. They were being let for storage. One was a fireworks store. Two of them were used for explosive stores. One by the police, one for a firework company. Totally inappropriate sorts of uses. They were still sucking up hundreds of thousands of pounds of taxpayers' money in their maintenance, but the public didn't have any access to them. So that all seemed wrong. We persuaded the government to let us develop them for public access and public use, the better ones as holiday lets. And these were developed with grant funding, which we received, which was great. We don't pay any rent on the building, so it's a good deal for us. But in the first 10 years, we banked more than 7 figures of income, which have all gone back into conservation of the buildings. So it's been spectacularly successful, really. And it's propped up also some of these totally, these small brown jobs, these totally non-commercial sites, these ruins, which have completely disappeared. This was the 18th century on the north coast that you couldn't even see. It was totally inundated with gorse. So the scheme's been very successful in helping fund the conservation of all these monuments. But it wasn't seen as hugely controversial at the time we started this in about 2005. Some objected because it was an inappropriate commercialisation focused on high-spending visitors rather than publicly focused. Well, actually, more than a quarter, a third of the use is by island residents. And the use of these ruin sites is almost entirely by island residents for picnics and parties. So ultimately, it's been seen as a regeneration of a community asset. It was also controversial because sites like this outside human use for decades have become very significant wildlife habitats. Particularly, there's a lot of protected wall lizards in Jersey that like living in all the holes and in this decaying masonry. So the ecological community was very upset by our plan to repoint and conserve and stabilise these ruins. In the end, all this work was done by masons under the supervision of ecologists. So it was possible to bring those together, and now more people are enjoying the biodiversity on site. So ultimately, it's been quite a successful project in an island-wide landscape sense. There's a second set of management issues I want to talk about, which is really about the place of expertise in the community and the nature of the island community itself as it is impacted by smallness. Now, this is a slightly fugitive matter, even for someone like me who's lived there all my life for 54 years. And I'm still trying to work out exactly how this works. So forgive me for sort of introducing it in a slightly tangential way. This is the dwarf deer from the Jersey dwarf deer from a cave on the north coast called Balhug. It's a really important example of the island dwarfing phenomenon, not uncommon in the Pleistocene, when mammals trapped on islands shrunk. What's unusual here is that the dating evidence, you've got dating evidence not only for the dwarf but for the full-size ancestor, which shows that the dwarf trapped in Jersey when the sea levels rose at that time shrank to a sixth of their size in less than 6,000 years. So it's a pretty rapid process. Why do they do that? Well, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's at least in partly to do with the importance of maintaining genetic diversity. So it's much better in the area of limited resource, isn't it, to have a large number of fewer animals breeding than a smaller number of large animals being supported by the same resource. And so, I use that as an example because what's true biologically also seems to be true of social development. In small islands, you do get this concentrated diversity. You get a level of social and institutional complexity that you might expect in a bigger community, but it's shrunk down at that level of complexity into our small space. So there's a very finely grained mosaic of values, interests, and identities competing in our small territory. And this affects the issue of heritage management. It's fueled by a surprising level of media. We've got 2 daily newspapers, a BBC radio station, an independent radio station, a TV station, all dedicated to Jersey. We've got 52 MPs effectively in our legislature. It means everything in Jersey is controversial. 3 people is a movement in Jersey. So, when I said that the restoration of those forts and towers was controversial, it was controversial with about 6 people, but that's a front page news story that could run for weeks. So I think in a sense, it's a good thing, a bit like with a dwarf deer. It's the tension between all those different identities that give the place some stiffness. Small systems are very, very vulnerable to change. So the social system may evolve as this fine-grained complexity. So it's not a bad thing, and it's not going to go away. So heritage management, everything else needs to work in that detailed environment. So it gives a very keen edge to the idea of community engagement and participation. And so that needs to be both at a small scale individual level and at a more insular level. And I'll illustrate this with two examples. This one at maybe the smaller level. So at the Hugby, the Passion's Grave site, that's our Archaeology museum, we're constructing a Neolithic longhouse as a 3-year volunteer project. It's led by Luke Winter, who did so much at the Ancient Technology Centre in Dorset. It's based on evidence from elsewhere. We haven't at that stage found any local Neolithic house evidence, although during the course of this project, Leslie McFadden from Birkbeck did find the remains of a Neolithic house in the west of the island associated with that fossilised woodland. So our aim in doing this is to give some visible substance to what otherwise might remain difficult for most people to interpret archaeological evidence when trying to persuade people of the significance of the need to protect this archaeological landscape beneath the present-day land surface. From a professional and expert perspective, there's obviously a huge amount of speculation in such a reconstruction, based essentially as it is on post holes from elsewhere. But it's attracted an absolutely enormous amount of local media attention on it positively. It's engaged important groups, especially corporate volunteers from the financial services sector that might otherwise not encounter archaeology at all. At least a dozen financial institutions in Jersey have sent teams of people up here for days at a time to work on this project. You might hesitate to involve very short-term volunteers like that on an archaeological site where the need for expertise and experience override, but this sort of reconstruction engagement project offers a very constructive alternative engagement. And I guess at its simplest, hundreds of people have got to understand a bit better what all those post holes might mean. Projects have brought together a lot of people from different strands of island life. So that's a kind of very focused example of engagement. At a slightly wider level, we're looking at projects that create a framework to align all these different heritage groups. So that's probably the most important opportunity in the project we're looking at to try to achieve a UNESCO Global Geopark designation for the island. And that's based in geological interest. The geopark idea links deep time stories with natural and cultural heritage and emphasises its value in terms of tourism. And it's one of the ways that we hope to respond to messages from the public that they value the idea of heritage chiefly at the landscape scale. It's not that easy for us to think beyond cultural heritage. We've started to review the listing and protections of sites of geological interest and looking at the same time links with cultural heritage stories. So this is one of our most important geological sites on the north coast. We're trying to tease out not just the geological stories of mineralization and sea level change, which it represents, but how that led to a mining industry in the 19th century, the traditional collection of seaweed, vrac as it's called locally for agriculture, and Victorian coastal tourism. And the geopark idea is proving quite a good way to integrate some of the providers of heritage in Jersey in this big heritage idea, much needed because the island has spawned an amazingly diverse mosaic of heritage groups. It's the island dwarfing phenomenon I talked about. So as well as Jersey Heritage, there's a local national trust which manages lands mainly, the Jersey Society, Société Jersey's, it's a research body, an occupation society which looks after many of the German bankers, and we hardly look after any of them. There's a national park of a Jersey variety, and a large number of what are heritage tourism providers who probably wouldn't identify as heritage groups, but provide the means by which a great deal of heritage is encountered through road trips, kayaking, surfing, climbing, diving, and eating. So it's a big project for us. How do we coordinate all of that? Now, all these fiercely defended identities and commercial interests competing make that quite a challenge. We were talking about it earlier today, but do you remember the old English heritage was always in trouble with heritage groups? So they always wanted a national champion, but they didn't want English heritage to interfere in what they did. And we get something like that as Jersey Heritage. So there's a call for a dominant body to be a champion for heritage, and that's an important role. But the smaller organisations with their defended identities are perfectly reasonably anxious about being subsumed or taken over. The effect of something like the J Park, because it invokes an external organisation like UNESCO with a phenomenal brand and international value, really does. It has an amazing effect of uniting everybody around the table without any of these local political baggage fears. So I think it is an extremely important aspect of our management of island heritage that we can engage partners, international partners like UNESCO, more focused partners like your Archaeology department. The impact on the community is not to be underestimated, how significant it is. So the last thing I want to talk about that's really feeds on from that point is about capacity. We are small. It's the other reason why these partnerships are significant. And this use of UK university partnerships to provide research expertise is really essential in generating new heritage stories to drive interest, attract attention, and contribute to our international profile. And the value of local heritage stories in international profiles come to the fore in the context of the island's need to address what you might call its place branding. I don't know what you think of when you think of Jersey. Maybe you still think of Bergerac. I think a lot of people, if not most people, think tax haven, if they think anything at all, because I think that there's a weak brand, there's a brand. The offshore finance thing is problematic and dominant. Through the Bergerac years, that association actually wasn't entirely negative. It was a very different time, wasn't it? The offshore finance thing tapped into those sort of seaside ideas, those exotic liminal places where the normal rules don't apply. It was all rather buccaneering in the 1980s, actually, to the extent that tourism also at that time was fueled by cheap beer and virtually free fags. That was also dependent on the tax situation. It was all really rather exciting. The Thatcherite period of deregulation was an important part of that context, how times have changed. And although, in fairness, Jersey financial services have also changed hugely in respect of international cooperation and information exchange, identity is a bit of a supertanker. It's very hard to change course, let alone turn anything around. But in efforts to do so, which are really important at the moment, do heritage stories have a part to play? And Lacotte, another picture of Lacotte, might be one example of that. So just a bit more background about Lacotte. So clues to the significance of Lacotte really first discovered in the 1880s. Bottom right are some of those early investigations. One of its most famous discoveries, the only late Neanderthal fossils in Britain, was made around the time of the First World War. The site was dug by Cambridge. That's a young Prince Charles in the picture top right as a student at Cambridge. And those excavations continued really through the 60s up into the 1970s. And then after a 25-year hiatus at the site where nothing happened, the impetus to re-examine the site came from a new generation of archaeologists. Some low-key investigations, coring and field walking island sites with students from Southampton and UCL started in 2009. And by 2012, the project was combining staff from UCL, Southampton, Manchester, Lampeter, and the British and Natural History Museums in what we were calling the Ice Age Island project. was supported initially by the local tourism development fund, in the absence of any other heritage funding in Jersey, on the basis that we would explore, the rather optimistic basis, to be honest with you, I thought at the time, that we'd explore the local development of archaeology in the field as a visitor attraction. I guess we were thinking particularly of Orkney and the cruise ships up there, where there's a very direct connection. I have to say, it did feel a rather optimistic challenge. Certainly the team, another bathymetric image, were very successful in attracting academic attention. And the early excavators looking for the land had imagined the large number of mammoths found in the caves to have come over the top of the cliff. Looking at the site from the sea the other way, and its network of ravines and valleys allowed the idea to emerge based on anthropological studies of hunters in more recent times, that Neanderthals may well have been collaborating to drive herds actually up the head of the valley into the ravine where they were killed. So it just flipped that perspective, and that achieved a significant amount of academic publication. What I hadn't realised myself at the time is just quite how well covered the academic story is in popular media. That was kind of something I wish I'd realised years and years ago. So some of those early work have really achieved some of this publicity, this brand publicity for Jersey that there's such a lot of interest in. The Ice Age sites in Jersey have featured British magazine TV, so that's Coast in the bottom right, Nick Crane with James Dilley. Digging for Britain, Alice Roberts has been a few times. BBC documentaries like Ice Age Giants. There's a long section on the cotton. I mean, that's 6 million UK visitors, and it's syndicated worldwide. So that kind of thing is enormously attractive to Jersey politicians. The discovery of, inverted commas, the earliest art in Britain was something that got Ed Blencorn and Neil Edwards on the Today programme, Radio 4, 8 o'clock in the morning, news at 10 that night. It really is quite fantastic what this project has delivered for Jersey in terms of that place branding. Now, much of that is really owed to the press office connections of UCL, in particular, and the British Museum, that can achieve this sort of media in a way that Jersey heritage, in Jersey, can't really hope to achieve. So the point is, it's not just the intellectual firepower or the students or even funding that these networks have brought us. So just a little bit more on the cotton. I guess it's also an island story in the sense it's about coastal zone management and the need for us to protect this incredible record of Neanderthal activity through climate change from this increasingly angry sea. The site's basically been washing away into this first identified by Cambridge initially in the 1950s, but we've only really acquired a lease for the site from the owners in the last year. And we have sunk nearly all of our charitable reserves, probably getting on for £750,000, into simply rock face stabilisation work to make it safe for archaeologists to work in. And we're very much hoping that will lead on to some further projects to conserve the site, protect it from the sea in the future. So finally, back to Elizabeth Castle, I guess another and relevant example of a university partnership, which we've been fortunate to benefit from the last couple of years in a growing relationship with Matt Davin and students from here. So the site's a tidal islet, really, just off the town of St Helier, site of a medieval abbey and Tudor to 20th century fortifications. It's a huge site of around 30 individual structures. Again, a huge amount of seawall, where most of the money we generate at the castle goes into many of the seawalls. Last couple of years, Matt and Dav and York students have helped explore the early 19th century military hospital at the bottom there, in anticipation of a refurbishment project we hope to undertake shortly, and for which we're seeking local funding. That field survey and documentary research and a short pilot study has given us some important contacts to take that project forward, and we'll be having a discussion about how we can continue the relationship around that. I mean, I'm going to give you a clue that one of the things that I'm going to be interested in is one of the big yet to get hold of heritage management issues in Jersey, which is the German occupation structures. So the hospital was one of a number of buildings at the castle that was quite badly damaged during the German occupation of the site. Very heavily fortified in 1943. This is a German soldier's snap of his time in the castle occupation. There's a large, grand battery of 24-pounders that was completely disappeared during the German occupation. For example, the site was used as a punishment camp for the organisation Todd. It's the military engineering group that supplied forced labour for the construction of the Atlantic Wall. And that fortification programme in the islands, as elsewhere, left an enormous number of gun emplacements. It said that 20% of the construction material for the whole Atlantic Wall was committed to the gun islands in a rather disproportionate way. The restoration and presentation of these structures is a really hotly contested issue, as you might imagine. It's a really good illustration of how those issues are framed by the tension between those looking out from an island and those looking in. In the immediate aftermath of the occupation, the bunkers were comprehensively looted and salvaged by islanders. The British Army set about removing these scars in the landscape lest they keep alive unhappy memories. Visits by UK scrap merchants continued right through the 50s and removed much of the artillery, leaving reminders in a landscape of liberation. Even at that time, some recognised their potential as tourist attractions. In Guernsey, the authorities, the Guernsey state, wrote to the War Office to suggest that some of these things that were being dismantled by the British Army should be left for future interest for tourists. But the island populations, maybe more so in Jersey, I don't know, were generally happy with this erasure of this landscape of occupation right through the 1950s and 60s. And in the dominant Churchillian narrative of military victory of the war, there wasn't any room for victims. So the stories of those people, the force workers who had built these bunkers, was really overlooked almost completely. In the mid-1970s, and this is next door to this enclosure, that just at the top right is the one you just seen, the Channel Island Occupation Society began to promote the idea that the bunkers and batteries could be restored as heritage tourist attractions, similar to the island's castles. So Battery Moltke on the north coast was restored with a gun which the 1945 Liberating Army had pushed over the cliffs. This was recovered by an army helicopter in the 1990s and conserved by enthusiasts. The claimed aim of the restoration was to actively promote reconciliation between former enemies. And the presentation of the restorations focused almost entirely on German soldiers and the capabilities of their weaponry, and excluded, consciously or not, those force workers who built them, as well as those who the German forces were occupying. But this was, and the programme still active, bottom-up heritages by a community of enthusiasts, quite skillful and knowledgeable, with a clear purpose, articulate set of values, free from interference by heritage professionals. In fact, when they started in the mid-70s, there weren't any heritage professionals in Jersey. They were absolutely correct that the presentations and these reconstructions and restorations certainly did and do prove popular with tourists. And because of that, they began to attract the attention of journalists outside the island, sometimes controversially. What heritage experts might see is the dissonance in the way that the bunkers were being presented, and the disinheritance of those who built them was criticised, sometimes very heavily, in the national press, in headlines like these. And that bottom headline about some current activity in Jersey is actually just from last year. It's not just the Guardian. Channel Islanders, maybe all islanders, are known for their dislike of outside criticism and interference, and this commentary did inevitably create something of a local furore, but it did lead to the first time to the issue being put by journalists, actually, to heritage professionals in Jersey who, and I count myself amongst their number, had remained mostly and carefully distant from this very sensitive and controversial area. In 2001, to commemorate the first Holocaust Memorial Day, Jersey Heritage opened a forced worker memorial in a bunker, which had been the first occupation museum in 1948. It's actually the one at Hope B, the archaeological site. It was controversial with some in the bunker restoration community and still stands largely alone. Indeed, its existence is sometimes used as a justification for the absence of reference to forced workers in the other bunkers, because all of that is covered at the memorial. So there's something of an ideological polarity. There's a polarity anyway, and it's partly amateur professional polarity, and which persists. On the one hand, a view that restoration tends towards aggrandizement of Nazi structures and comes close often to a celebration of the German war effort. On the other hand, a view that these structures form part of a continuous landscape of fortification, including the Napoleonic, Tudor, medieval and prehistoric defences, and are no more dangerous. The structures, which are largely publicly owned, remain in the management of the society. And meanwhile, the professionals have focused on attempts to move the narrative structures framing the occupation along from the monuments, including the monuments, but trying to cover other subjects. So especially with Ginny Carr at Cambridge, we've looked to bring light to new stories of victims of Nazi tyranny and acts of resistance by islanders that just aren't there in the fortification narrative. So the Lighthouse Memorial on the left is dedicated to local political prisoners who died in concentration camps. Public art's been commissioned to recognise forced workers. That figure at the bottom is by Morris Black, camp survivor on the forced worker memorial. The surrealist photographer Todd Cahoon in the Resistance Trail, which is a video trail at the top in a photograph shortly after her release from prison, where she was under sentence of death for spreading anti-Nazi literature. And the bottom right, this last year, that's Mark Regev, the Israeli ambassador, who came to unveil a Jersey Heritage Blue plaque to a woman that had hidden a Jewish friend in her basement during the occupation. So in that programme of new stories, we tried to link with wider European narratives. Setting the fortifications in an outward-looking, wider context might help in broadening the perspective of the inward-looking presentation of the Bible alone. And of course, we're not alone in that difficult question of challenges in conserving that World War II heritage at a time of resurgent right-wing culture in Europe. So that's an interesting set of challenges. There are some German material at the castle, which we have avoided generally. It's getting to the time where we have to address that as heritage organisation. It's definitely something that we're in the market for some interesting discussions with others about how that can best be achieved. So that's it. I hope I've highlighted some interesting issues about Jersey and heritage and culture and characteristics of heritage in islands. And they include this issue of boundedness and smallness, the presence and everything of the sea and the coast and those coastal processes, questions of this concentrated social diversity and identities, questions of isolation and the connecting role of international bodies like UNESCO, questions of capacity and the opportunity for resourceful academic partnerships. Hope that may be of interest to develop in the future. We could certainly use the help.
Thank you very much, John. That's really fascinating. Can I open the floor up to any questions? I suppose. Sorry, Lou.
Can you tell me how you're obviously not able to apply funding from the Coastal Fund, but are you able to have a sort of relationship with benefactors, perhaps in a way that is unique to Jersey? So I just wondered if you could tell us something about that.
You mean there's a lot of money, private money in Jersey and doing that? Yes. It is often supposed that it would be that easy, and I guess it is probably true of tax havens, if I can use that slightly unattractive expression, that most people that are in that kind of environment are quite international people. They don't necessarily have local royalties. And when they are generous, they're generous in a lot of places. But it may also be the case that there's a reason why they're taking their money offshore. We work very hard with Lacoste, for example, to raise money privately. It just doesn't fire the imagination of people in that bracket. The coin hoard, maybe because it's about, does attract a deal of interest. So it's very, very patchy, but generally people with that level of private money feel they will get a bigger bang for their generosity by giving it to the state than giving it to Jersey Heritage. And it is absolutely true that they will. And the same applies for corporates. Back in the day, in the 80s, it was a lot of companies were locally owned. You'll take the managing director out for lunch to give you a check. Literally, there and then at the time, I can remember that happening. After a period of consolidation, most of those companies are consolidated and owned. There's an office in Zurich. It takes about a year to get an answer from somebody, and it's very limited. So I don't want to sound like a sob story, because Jersey is a very wealthy place. But there are lots of specific local reasons why it's very hard for us to access that money.
Thank you very much.
So I have a kind of, I don't want to get hung up on money, but I just have a supplementary to that, which is, where does Jersey sit in relation to Europe and Brexit and funding from the European Union?
Yeah, well, we have never been part of Europe. We have a bit of a currently have your cake and eat it deal around Protocol 3 of the accession treaty, which will go, and where that will leave us is uncertain. But in respect of your question, is that we've never been directly eligible for that type of funding. However, local projects have benefited from European money where we have partnered with an applicant from the UK. So Chile Car, for example, got quite a substantial grant of European money for a website project that's about resistance to Nazism in the Channel Islands. We registered as a partner for that. We didn't receive any money directly, but Heritage in Jersey have received the benefit. So it's an interesting question. I 100% understand the answer, but I do know that it's an issue of relevance to this business of our partnering with UK and European institutions. One of the many reasons why it's so.
Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned at the start about developing the historic environment record, and I just wondered whether you saw the goal as kind of replicating what's been done before, or developing something that's completely new and different in the context of Jersey.
Replicating what's been done before in the UK.
Yes,
I mean, is it a model?
Yeah.
Well, I have to say, coming from a pretty rudimentary starting point of there being absolutely nothing, but I suppose I see it, and I'm not, as I said, I'm not an archaeologist, I see it in a rather non-specialist way of just creating something that enables people off outside, like if they're doing an INA Shorthorpe map, for example, just to be aware of what's there, and locally to support some of these incoming project teams. I have pretty much, as the client, I've pretty much asked Dr. Chown here, say, provide us with the best possible historic environment record you can.
Yes, but that's what we're trying to do. It's like the systems in England, which generally grew out of sites and monuments records. We've begun from scratch. The information has been scattered all over Jersey and outside of Jersey as well. And this is not intended to be a planning development tool. The states of Jersey planning have a database which has their designated sites on there, which they do use in planning. And we hope that planning officers will access the HER. But we see it as being much more than just a simple record as you might get in the traditional HER, although they are changing in England as well. Hence our interest in deposit modelling, bringing in language, bringing in folklore, and ultimately bringing in the natural heritage as well. So we have a sort of hashtag we're developing for it, which is Heritage Hub. And that's the way we see it, rather than being something closely aligned to England. But having said that, we are following the conventions. We use the Midas conventions and so on as well. And we do take guidance from what's happening internationally. So it will actually fit in that sort of wider context.
Thank you, Peter. Any final questions? No? Okay. May I ask you to thank John again for coming all this way and for giving such an interesting talk.
Sorry I went on so long. I wasn't
No, it was good stuff. It's all good. A reminder, there will be another Yours seminar next week, so do please come along again. And there will, of course, be the obligatory trip to the pub immediately after this. So do feel free to come out and join us for a drink. But thank you very much again, John. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.